Hi, we're Oxygen Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions.
John, welcome to the Shoot Room Sessions on Tour.
Thank you, Richard. It's a pleasure so far to be here.
So we're at 8 Harvard Square, which is our first on-location shoot, thanks to our new sponsor, Nipreg. So a shout out and a thank you for providing us a space in London. And this feels like the most decadent episode I've ever wanted to do, because
That's totally in character for me then. Good.
since reading your book Green Swans and then Tickling Sharks afterwards, I've just been in awe, John, of your career and the things that we're doing today that people tell us are innovative and different. You've been doing for 50 years. So I'm blessed that you've been wanting to come and sit with us, and I'm super excited about some of the stories you're going to share.
Well, I'm hoping to poke you a little bit and hear your stories as well. So that sounds like how that goes.
Can you tell people who you are and how you describe what you do?
I try very hard not to describe what I do because in the days when there were environmentalists and I was one of them, if you got anywhere within spitting distance of people in business, they would see you as just beyond the pale. They wouldn't want to have anything to do with you. So I would allow people, encourage people to think I was an economist, an engineer, accountant, God save us. I mean, anything but an environmentalist. Because if they ever had that label in their mind, they would discount 99.9% of anything you would say on related issues. It's now a badge of honor. I mean, if you go into business and you say, no, I've got that history, they're intrigued, but they weren't there. So I'm very careful how I present myself, which is, again, I've had titles like chief entrepreneur, chief pollinator, these sorts of things, just to give me a little bit of breathing space, bit of flexibility.
As to recreate in the moment to be who you want to be.
To sort of try and undermine people's expectations and have them sort of come into sort of a human conversation. And one of the things I found quite early in dealing with people, including people of very senior levels in business, they are also human beings at some level.
Did the seniority ever bother you? Did it occur to you they were just another person to have a conversation?
Honestly, it never did. And I've sometimes wondered why. And I think when I was a child, I was born with, I think, something like 7 grandparents already. And that their number just grew because my paternal grandfather was bigamous, and everyone got married, got divorced, got married again, got divorced. So it was a proliferation of elderly folk within orbit. And there were some of them I just loved, and I loved teasing them. Even when I was 4, I started calling my paternal grandmother by her Christian name, which that time was simply not done. And I love that interplay. And that sort of almost flipped. Now I'm the elderly creature in the corner, and dealing with younger folks.
That creeps up on you. So
It sort of does.
I'm the second oldest person in our company in 41. So I remember, like, literally 20 years ago being the young person in the room, the jokes being made about being young, and now it's completely inverted. Happy spats.
Hopefully we'll get to a point where those jokes aren't quite as cruel as they sometimes were.
Maybe. So, this is quite charmed. I'm about to ask you, John. How would you describe the contents page of your career? Can we break it into sections so you can give people a kind of overview of some of the different chapters you've enjoyed and some you might not?
I think the central theme of what I've done has been trying to engage business and through business markets in a series of new conversations, which initially people in those worlds were really not willing or prepared to have. They just didn't think they were remotely relevant. So there's been an ambassadorial or a diplomatic side to what I do. So I take what people in boardrooms, or what we'd now call C-suite, the corporate suite or whatever, sort as semi-revolutionary. I mean, genuinely, when I first went into that sort of world, people would see environmentalists as basically communists under another label, and they didn't like them. They didn't trust them. They weren't interested in what they had to say on anything. So my challenge was to try and get people to begin to open up. In my teens, I had a very old friend who was 40 when I met her. I was 14, and she taught me how to weave. And one of the things that really struck me was about weaving is if you got a fiber sheet, fleece or whatever, and you want to open the fiber up for a dye, you use a chemical called a mordant that opens the fiber up. And in some ways, I feel what I've done with the corporate brain is to begin to help to open it up, and very carefully, not saying to people, I know what their future is because I've talked to people out there, or trust me, but basically saying there is a future that's emerging that you don't yet even begin to understand. Don't trust me. Talk to other people out there. And if you want us to help bring them in, Greenpeace or whoever, will help do that. So it's been a bridge building exercise. It's been a diplomatic exercise. It's also just finding it's enabled me to do what I'm most interested in doing, which is just learning continuously. And so colleagues know if I ever get to the point of being comfortable or knowing what I'm meant to be doing and how to do it, something in me dies. I just want to be elsewhere. I'm going through one of those moments. It's very so not in this conversation, but body in my life.
As you were saying, the team off camera were pointing at me with that exact saying it. That's it, John. If I say I'm bored for a day, the team gets worried because they'll go, what are we doing?
I often say it's my critical skill. I get forward. I mean, I'm still with the same wife after 7 years, but in thinking and ideas and practice, I do get bored.
So I've been asked this question before and I'd never had the opportunity to ask it of anybody else. So look, you asked me before we started recording, I'm not sure when we started recording, but about whether there was a singularity point that we were aiming at in things. Yeah. And it isn't. For me, it's always been, what next? How do we improve? So what's the next thing I can learn? I remember coming up finishing my PhD Bible, walking up and someone said, congratulations. And I said, what for? Because I was thinking about what I was going to do next. I could remember the last one. I was 57 years with your wife.
Yeah.
I was once asked, nothing else in your life you're satisfied with. It's always what next, what next. Why are you satisfied and how? So why is your relationship with your wife the one bit that you haven't felt the need to reinvent and to push on that?
Well, I think it has reinvented. I think if you're in that sort of relationship for that long with anyone, then you both have to co-evolve in a way. And I think that's happened. And sometimes it's been painful, and sometimes it's been exciting, and sometimes it's been both at the same time. I think she's curious too. I think she's also, I met her hitchhiking. We happened to be both at the same university. She was leaving the university. I was just coming in. So she's always been several years older. But she's always been incredibly supportive of what I do. And I often say, no, I couldn't have done all the books and all the companies I've involved and so on without having that sort of confidence that somewhere I was anchored to something. And she's also been interested in it all. So that's been wonderful.
I describe it, so Helen she's 30, soon to be 35. We've been together since she was 17. So more than half her life now. Yeah. And I think couples that work over an extended period, you haven't fallen in love once, you've done it 4 or 5 times with the person that you evolved to and the culmin change. I was a nightmare in my early 20s when we met. I was uber competitive, playing sport at a high level, very masculine, very arrogant, and she taught me how to be a plausible person, so I'm very grateful.
Well, I'm Helen, and I worked on the lane. That's fine. Our friend is a shout out to one else.
Your journey of opening up businesses to new conversations, that's ultimately been quite a patient process, because that's developed over years as we've seen the sector move. From your perspective of when you went for a meeting and you tried to move the conversation forward a little or perhaps a lot, were you aware you were going to need to be patient? And how did you process that these ideas would take time to germinate things?
I mean, people who live with me and people who know me would say I'm not particularly patient. But there is a sense that you quite quickly build that if you're going to try and change some of these big institutions that create in many ways the fabric of a modern life, you can't do it overnight. And if you believe that's possible, you just burn out very, very quickly, indeed. And I used to joke about 25, 30 years ago that I'd always envied James Bond and the work that I did, because every time he got into the villain's control center, he always knew which button to press. And I never do, and I never did. And I'd be I'd like to be in a situation like that for a while to get a sense of what linked to what and what you would have to do in order to change things a little. But I'm not that patient, even in those relationships. And I have been times when, for example, we were working with Monsanto back in the mid-1990s, and we spent 18 months at the behest of their chief executive officer, CEO at that stage, Bob Shapiro, working on genetically modifying crops and bringing stakeholders into the process. And after 18 months, we were very clear that Monsanto were headed into a brick wall in Europe on these sorts of products. And that is exactly what happened to them. They lost a huge amount of value as a result. But I flew to see them in the United States and was talking to the CEO on the day that I arrived, except that he'd had to fly to New York and Wall Street in order to talk to investors on that particular day. So I didn't see him. I saw his head of the whole food business, gloriously named Hugh Grant. And he knew nothing about the work that we were doing, which is all about food. I thought, that's a really poor result for us and a way for them. So I resigned. I had my then company, Sustainability, resign from that relationship. It was at that stage very unusual that any consultancy would resign and do so publicly, which we did. And weirdly, about 4 months later, Bill Ford at Ford Motor Company invited me to come in and was quite keen to work with us. And his second question to me was, if you had a relationship with Ford, what would it take to get to the point where you'd want to resign it? So he knew that we weren't simply professional, but there was some form of small p political element to the work that we do. So yeah, I can be patient for a while, but every so often something breaks.
Reading between the lines, I always felt you might be patiently impatient in the respect that the variety, the range of clients and topics and subjects. If you look at your background, you're one of those people that's bedtime. Like, it's not possible to fit in the books, the companies, the boards, the engagements into the amount of years. It just doesn't let one you live.
That's where Zane comes in, because in a sense, when I was saying, but I used to work through the night, and I wrote the books, a lot of them, at home in evenings and weekends. So, and we have two wonderful daughters, and one of the Gaia said, she's now in her late 40s. She said her favorite sound when she was a child was hearing elsewhere in the house the sound of the typewriter. One of used typewriters, me clattering away. She said when she heard that, she could go to sleep. So yeah, you do bend time to some degree, but it's just also, it's been endlessly fascinating. Just these endless series of manicures to find.
I think because, and I found it later in my career. So really early in my career, as I was working my way through the public sector, which I'm sure we'll get on to. It would have killed me. Horrific. Yeah, it was horrific. I did 9 years. I had 16 jobs in 9 years. Every 6 months, I was like, no one's doing anything. I'm going to leave. So they promoted me.
Yeah.
It's spending time in there is even worse. We actually had George Eustace on the podcast a couple of weeks ago.
I saw that one.
It was so cathartic for those because he was able to say, when I did this, what happened in the machine? And I'm like, nothing, George. I knew it.
But you was there for 9 years and over memory. I mean, that's extraordinary in that world.
The thing that really kicked me about George is I'd never heard the story of why he got into politics before the podcast. So defending his family farm against what pretend to be corrupt bankers.
Yeah.
Why had no one ever told anyone that? I did. Had you heard that story before?
I hadn't.
Nor had I. And I cross over a lot with him there. So I think, if we'd have heard that, it would have carried him far more credibility and positivity with the team. But as I got more senior roles, the busier I got meant I could do that interjection that you were doing with the chief execs, give them time to ponder and think about it while I worked around 3 or 4 other problems.
Yeah.
So by the time I came back, they had plenty of time to breathe. But I can still be furiously working on lots of things. And it strikes me you did very similar.
It's also true. I like listening to people because and then it's genuine. I don't do it because it's an acquired skill order. I just fascinated to hear how people think and how they then communicate. what they're thinking and what's important to them. And over time, you can build a 3 or 4 dimensional picture of somebody. And some degree, working even with very senior people, I mean, it's a gift if they'll give you that amount of time. But those conversations are part of what I do and have done. And I was never trained to do it. It's just something that bubbled up somehow.
Well, and it's well practiced. You drilled it over the years in terms of so much of that listening to conversation and nuance. And if you were continuously improving and getting better at it, you wouldn't be in the rooms you were in, having the conversations you were having.
So you progress. I mean, I've always wondered about that because I think that if you are, one of the things I've done over the years and since mid-1990s is try and track these big societal pressure waves that impacted first government and business, now financial markets and so on. And I've always felt that if you have that sense of how waves build and when the next one is coming, and you happen to have circle and you get out there a little ahead of most people, then you could ride that wave. But that doesn't mean necessarily that you're actually either creating the wave or that you know exactly where it's going to go or anything of that sort of stuff. So I'm always quite cautious about claiming agency in all of this. I mean, I happen to be reasonably good at picking up what's coming next and then sort of trying to get ahead of those sorts of dynamics. But in these business conversations, it's one of the blessings has just been getting inside not just companies, but inside industries and understanding how they operate and how they see the world. I mentioned Bob Shapiro at Monsanto. And incidentally, one of the things we've always done is talk about named companies or named individuals, which then, people going to work with us. It tends to have them thinking long and hard.
Well, it's self-selecting as well, right?
Yes.
So they know it's coming, so they're choosing. It's a bit like we talked about using playful and creative job titles. Well, if anyone sees a job title from us and goes, oh, that's a bit too silly,
Yeah.
well, then you're not going to like the culture.
Yeah.
So I think you being so honest about that, if someone like did offers and asked to work with you, they know what they're getting.
They sort of do over time. I don't think people early on perhaps did. And I talk about gaily about resigning clients. I mean, there have been times when we've been thrown out of these organizations as well. So they can work both ways.
That probably got bigger smile when they resigned. And you've had some really interesting situations of people you've chosen to work with and what hasn't happened. So the two that jump out to my mind from your last book were Shell and McDonald's.
Yeah.
Can you talk about those two scenarios? And
Well, I don't think McDonald's was never a client, but they asked to be. Later on, they became one for my then company, Sustainability. But what happened then was that with the young colleague Judy Hales, I wrote a book called The Green Consumer Guide in 1988, and to our complete, I felt this wave was coming around consumer interest in environmental and green issues, which is why I suggested Julia we do the book.
And what does feel it coming look and feel like for people? Do you see echoes everywhere? Is it purely an emotional thing? When you feel that way, Cooley, what does that mean to you?
I think it's a tough question to answer because I'm now 30, 40 years from some of those feelings. And very often we tend to sort of interpret backwards, project backwards, for the now. Yeah. So, but I think I think what it feels like is an anxiety, an ache, a sense of excitement, a sense of if there's an electrical storm building and your hair's starting to go up on your head, it's that in a way, and trying to explain that to other people is an absolute bugger, if I can use a technical term, because if you've done it a number of times, then people have some degree of confidence. You might be in the process of doing it again.
My analogy with that is recruitment.
Yeah.
So I adore recruitment. I've probably been involved in legitimately thousands. And from a sporting background, the assessment of talent is something I adore doing.
Yeah.
And the way I describe it in an interview is that it's not a hell yes, it's a no. And part of that is a feeling, but you can only get that once you've felt it. So people are recruiting for the first time until they've got someone who's sat in the room and who people have gone, oh my God, I cannot believe we have the opportunity to work with you. Until you have felt that, you don't understand what it means, that sentence and that construct.
I don't love recruiting, and in a sense, I've done a lot less it in recent years, but when I did do it, it was very peculiar in the sense that people would come in and I would sit with them on. We always had sofas and couches, and we have conversation. And for me, if it lasted more than an hour and a half, 2 hours, it was a good sign. And I tend to say to people, if you'd be interested, join us for 6 months and we'll see how it plays um, through. But then some of those people said the most terrifying moment was, I would then say, that's all good, but I'd like you to meet the team. And we'll have a lunch or tea or whatever, all around the same table. And so people would ask what questions they liked. And that to me seemed to be partly a welcoming into the tea and into our world, but also a final test as to whether this person has the capacity to deal with that. That's become harder to do, that style of,
We do exactly that.
oh, you do? Well, I'm thrilled that long may it last.
Yeah, we couldn't have done it in the public sector realm, where we absolutely are. We definitely enjoyed that. Forgive me. So back to the McDonald's and the Shell scenarios.
Well, with McDonald's, we did this book, and McDonald's, about 6 months after the book was released, and it gone to #1 in the non-fiction sales charts and so on, and suddenly McDonald's noticed that young people were coming into the restaurants and challenging them on tropical rainforest and so on, and they worked out where it was coming from. So they launched a sort of court injunction, which meant that we had to take the book when it was right at the peak of its success in the UK, out all bookstores in the UK. And I went to see I'll tell the story in the book, but I went to see a set of lawyers who basically said, you just got a cave. There's no way you can go up, defeat an adult. And then I was leaving, and one of the lawyers with a side twinkle said, unless of course you want to play poker. I'd never played poker in my life, but I know the principles of the game. I know bluff comes into it a lot. And the next day I had to go down to Cardiff and do a BBC program, sort of radio program, and 8 million people apparently listened to this. I was on panel with Pamela Stevenson, the comedian, the Eyes Wolf, who was that sort of television scientist, and Pat Kane of Hue and Cry, a band. And partway through this on-air broadcast, Pat said he'd read the book on the coming down from Glasgow, and he just repeated all of the accusations against the dolls. And there was a live audience of 80 people. 2 of those people were from McDonald's. And literally, they both ran up after us and said, you can't do this, you're under an injunction. I said, it wasn't me, it was him. And incidentally, we now know enough to sort of see you in court. And there was this frozen moment. And they were both women, very nice women, but one of them said, would you talk to our president? I said, well, if he were in me, assuming it was a he, and he did the following morning when I got back to London. And he said, well, how can we get you off our backs? And I said, well, I'm making it up on the fly. And firstly, I want evidence that you have written environmental policy statements. And I also want clear evidence that you are properly auditing, monitoring this around the world, wherever you operate. And it was the longest pause I've ever heard on a call, at the end of which he said, give us 2 weeks. And then I went into one of the big buildings here, actually, in Docklands, right up on the top, and they'd flown in presidents and vice presidents and all of their lawyers. And I was there with my editor. And we spent 5 hours with them, at the end of which they said, would you work with us? And I said, over my dead body, I've seen enough of this coming up. But then a little after, McDonald's did do something good. They took antibiotics under their supply chains at a time when no one else was doing that. So even sort of uncomfortable companies sometimes do good things. With Shell, that was a kind of relationship, and an odd one, where they'd had these big disasters with the Brent Spar oil platform and the North Sea. Greenpeace really dented their reputation there. And then with their executions of Gensar Awiwa, his colleagues, 9 of them total in Nigeria. And I've been working with Shell at that time. And I'd done a session with about 30 of their senior colleagues in Rotterdam. And right at the end of the session with these people, I said, is Shell right or wrong on Brent Spar in particular? And there was this, and then we did a count, and out of the 30, it's split half and half. Oh, that's interesting. That's going to be everything to do with some of these people are Swedish, Scandinavian, some are from the Philippines. It's going to be developed country versus developing. That's going to be the seismic ballpark. It wasn't. It was all to do with age. And the older the people were, the more likely they would think, well, of course Shell's right. It's always right. It's just these stupid people out there don't understand business as it has to be done. And the younger people would think, no, there's a value shift going on. And Shell is caught up in that and doesn't properly understand where things are going. So we refused, on the basis of that evidence that there was this cultural split within the company. For 2 years, we refused to work with Shell. And then they tricked us in a way, looking back, because they said, we're going to do an essay competition. We're going to get 4 different competitive consultancies to do an essay on what we should do as a company. And I'd just come up with a measure of triple product mine. So we did an essay, just thinking this is just an essay. And they came back and said, well, you've won, but we wanted you to do it with another one of the competitors, AGL, I pretty little as was. So we ended up working with them. And one of the things you learn there is that these very big oil and energy companies, they wake up every so often and then they go back to sleep again. So they go through cycles.
And change with leadership, is that the individual that wakes up and as soon as they become sentient, they move them aside and bring someone else in his sleep?
Very often also it's an age thing again, that somebody is getting to the end of their career and suddenly they can afford to see a wider world that they couldn't see at earlier stage in there. And it was Mark Brody-Stewart, who was then the CEO of Shell, who pulled us in. Very different character, wife from a Quaker background and so on. So just much more open. And the guy who replaced him, Phil Watts, I mean, he was actually thrown out of the company because of a sort of a screw up over booking oil reserves. And he went off and became a priest. I mean, you sort of would struggle to make up some of this stuff. But Phil Watts, when he became CEO, sent me off to Nigeria to look at what Shell should be doing there. And I came back and said to him, I think you should get out of the country, which they're now trying to do. He would not talk to me out of that. So sometimes you tell people what you feel they need to hear, but they don't want to hear it. And they can't hear it in some way. So two cases there, McDonald's and Shell, which is slightly different, but
It's cognitive dissonance, isn't it? On their part and mine, I would do, yeah. I always, the best illustration I heard about that was with Tony Blair and everything that relates to Iraq. In the, whether he was right or wrong,
yeah,
his consciousness can never possibly allow him to think he might be wrong, because the damage that would do to him as an individual to recognize that would just be unpalatable. He couldn't come back from that if you do think, actually, I completely got this wrong and caused that much damage. So it's almost, the view is that mentally is protecting himself from that truth and realization. Yeah, running an oil company, you could totally see how that might be part of your psyche.
but it does is exactly as you say, it goes down to individuals. And it's a combination of an individual at a very senior level within an organization, in this case a business, and the contextual dynamics, which sort of give no choice but to at least begin to think about whatever it is.
I think it's so fascinating how many times you encounter somebody where absolute opposites are true. So I think the following is true of both governments and leadership in general sense. They're so important, but also they don't really matter at the same time. So I think I always talk about, I'm trying to be a bit kinder to the Labour government after probably attacking the Conservatives somewhere.
Yeah. But it's in the new, I've got to give him a chance at least. We'll come on to Burke consistent in a minute. But I've often said people are waiting for the government to come and save them of things. They're not coming. That's not what they're there for. They don't matter. But when you look in the investment world, government policy and regulation really does matter. Yeah. And the same is true of leadership. So it's the most important thing in a team or a group. But also
the culture's more important than the leader. So I think both these can be true at the same time.
And I think part of, I suppose, the sense that I have to develop over time is for that combination where there are cultural dynamics and there is an organization which is under pressure with a potential leader who can do something useful. But trying to understand, particularly the individual, is really hard because they don't come around and say, I'm the solution to your every prayer. I mean, you have to work at it for a while, and some of them are very glib. They're very good at pretending, that they have this capacity. I think Blair's got it, that to project the personality, which is charming and all the rest of it. But that's possibly what he's then trying to defend when the reality crashes in.
Can we talk about the triple bottom line?
We could try.
Do you remember where you first had that thought or the concept?
Well, I don't remember because it crept up on me for a while. There was a organization called Business Council for Sustainable Development, now the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, and they talked about eco-efficiency, which was absolutely fine. It was how do you make or save money by doing the right thing on waste management, energy efficiency, pollution control, whatever. I thought that's perfect if you're an engineer. But if you look at the bigger context within which companies operate, there's a social dimension. There's a much wider economic, not just financial dimension. So I've had this sort of struggle going on in my brain for about 18 months and had a young colleague, Andrew Spencer Cook, and she and I just were playing it back and forth constantly over that sort of time. And then suddenly, one morning, I woke up with Triple Bottom Line in my brain. I once read Paul McCartney saying he did the same yesterday, and he couldn't. I'm not comparing the two, but he said he couldn't believe that he hadn't heard it somewhere before. And I had exactly that same feeling. So I got in touch with people saying, is this your concept? Have you heard it before? And people would say, no. But the odd thing was, to your point, where did it first start? This was 94 where it finally occurred to me. But 20 years later, I very rarely reread books, but I was cleaning up some bookshelves and came across a book called The Third Wave by Arthur Toffler. And I loved this book, Future Shock. Third Wave came out in 1980, and I read it that year. And I was skimming through it, and I don't know, what was probably page 267, there was a subtitle. And it said multiple bottom lines. And as soon as I saw that, I knew that 14 years before I came up with Triple Bottom Line, that seed had been planted. So it's a convoluted story in a way. And then People, Planet, Profit or Prosperity came up the following year in 1995.
How do you read, John?
I read all the time, compulsive reader in a way, and I read different streams. So I read fiction, I read non-fiction, alternating. But I also, now I part read a lot of books. I skim read them, particularly if they're non-fiction. And I'm at anyone's say,
I feel guilty about that. I'll skip a couple of pages and almost feel guilty about.
Oh, that's enough. But it's your reading that's important, not the book. And when I do find books that hold me word for word, page for page, chapter by chapter, right from beginning to end, what a blessing that is. But if you've got to access the stuff that's coming at you through the print media, you can't read every word. And so I'm justifying my own style of engagement with the world of books.
I'm leading in. I'm a highlighter pen and a scribble in the margin guy.
I'm still here and sort of do little. I had a very good friend when I was doing my postgraduate degree at UCL. She was American, and she used to do these very neat little marginal things. I do that. It's just echo purchase on Go, but
it doesn't work for me electronically. I need a physical book.
Yeah.
And I can't apply the concepts as well. So I only read factual, so I don't read fiction. I haven't got there yet. And I came to books really late. So
first person in my family to finish school, never mind uni. There were books around.
Yeah.
I came to books really late on a holiday with my wife's parents where I was complaining about being bored. And she drew a book at me and said, "You can't moan until you read this." And
What was the book?
oh, this is embarrassing.
No, what was it?
It was a collection.
toilet.
No, it's worse. It was a collection of Jeremy Clarkson articles from a newspaper that was in this biller. So
He's a clever writer, no question.
there are tools and techniques of his. Yeah.
I sort of wonder whether the fact that it was Jeremy Clarkson wasn't significant in its own right. I mean, I will see there's a bit of a shown tank flip with flamethrowers going here, which were absolutely careless of anyone. I doubt that's exactly your character, but maybe there was something about the willingness to crash through expectations and assumptions, so I think.
You didn't just invent the triple online. At one point, you also recalled the concept. That's a lovely, playful story. You sure?
Well, again, you asked earlier whether was there a magic moment where suddenly bingo, something popped into the brain, a triple bottom line would do. With the recall, I just have a slightly playful brain, and I like the Japanese idea of koans, where you do something that's deeply provocative and just jumps people to a different level of thinking. And so this idea of the product recall, it partly came from working with companies like Ford and Volvo and Toyota and so on, because they do that all the time. They have to. So I thought, well, I'm not comfortable with the way that the triple bottom line has been understood, because I'd always intended it to be an integrated way of thinking about accounting, about management systems and the rest of it. But what had started to happen was I thought I saw people saying, actually, back trade-offs, but business does trade-offs all the time. So you'd hear people say, the economic bit, so economic, social, environmental, the economic bit, well, we make a profit, that's T. Well, no, because there's this much wider economic context that you should be paying into. Social, well, we give people employment and jobs, and we give them what they want in terms of products and services. Tick. Well, no, there's a much bigger context there again. And then they would often say, shame about the environment. We're doing all this good stuff, there's a dent in the natural world. Although sometimes saying the same about social science. And I said, well, is there some way that you can actually get people to rethink? So I got in touch with the Harvard Business Review and said, would you take a piece on this? And they were just they said, this is the first time anyone in history, known history of Harvard Business Review, anyone's ever recalled a management concept. Love to do it. So they did it. And it was really interesting because the response was broadly very positive. People took it in the spirit that it was intended in. But a few people, particularly business school academics, particularly two of them in Brazil, came back very, very energetically to say, how dare you? We've just built our careers around this concept. But I'm thinking of those two Brazilians, both of them backed off and actually became supportive over time. But largely because I didn't respond by saying, oh, Fabio, you too. I tried to engage them. Why? What are you missing? And part of, I think, what people are missing is that even people in business didn't understand what a product recall was. They thought this was the end of the story. Trump bottom line's dead. But no, I was saying, no, product recall is where you have a perfect good product, but its tires are blowing out, or its spark plugs are doing something with the keel. You pull it back, you fix that, and you put it back down the road. That was the idea.
I love that. How can you create those quantum leaps in business and industry? I sometimes think they're the most visible in sport. So you look at something like Shane Warne, when 25 years ago he bowled the best delivery that's ever been bowled on a cricket pitch. He bowled Mike Gatty. He got more turn bound stick on a ball than anyone thought was possible. All of a sudden, the potential of what someone could do bowling their speed has just been redefined. And when you can make a leap like that, you can move a bit like COVID did for remote working. Yeah, it moved in 2 or 3 years, what might have took 20 years to do otherwise. I think those seismic leaps and jumps are so important to business, and we need a heck of a lot more of them now than we've ever had before.
I totally agree. I mean, one of the things I have to admit is I have always had antibodies, very strong ones, to sport. and I'm trying to steer as clear from it as I possibly could. You of cricket, John? I hate cricket. My sisters love cricket, and I love to see in the background a cricket match on the village green as I'm passing by. But I'd never go and watch it. Oh, I find it dirty boring.
It's like the only, from everything I've read of you, it's about the only way our interests and ways of thinking divide is on sport.
But what I am interested in is how, exactly as you say, these inflection points is sport. And somebody like Jesse Owens, in 1936 in Nazi Germany, just by the very virtue of being black and successful, challenged the Nazi mindset. So that bit, I'm fascinated by.
And they happen all the time. There's been an amazing thing in the last 10 years or so, which brings together my loves of sport and data in basketball. And I'm not a basketball man, but they realised
I quite liked the Harlem Globetrotters when it was on television back in the 1920s.
so that's the creativity and the flamboyance that you bring to play.
It was stagey.
Yeah, in the basketball world, they realise if they shot 2-point shots from close, they might do a 60% chance of shooting them. If they went to a 3-point range, that dropped to the high 40s. But because the benefit was 33% more, it was much more efficient in terms of game theory to completely change your approach and shoot long-range 3-point shots than close-range 2. Yeah. And where that massively transformed the game is, you no longer had to be a 7-foot tall person who could put the ball in the net. You could be a much smaller athlete. So it meant, because the draft system, players that were very valued, all of a sudden, the cheap ones had far more impact on the game. So it completely changed the kind of squads. So you get so many of those inflection points in sport that I love.
Well, the fact that just as a sort of self-declaration, the sort of form of activities that I've always enjoyed are things like cycling, shooting and archery. They're things you tend to do on your own rather than in team.
Cycling counts. I think there's some fascinating inflection points around elite cycling at the moment. I mean, what's happening in the Tour de France with Tadej Pogacar just redefining what's possible in terms of physical.
I have no idea what you're talking about, but it sounds absolutely riveting.
Best performance cyclist in the world. And it said you were arranging books on this stuff. Yeah, that can be your next
I'll
lot.
get them. I'll read the covers.
Okay, cricket first. So from inflection points to a place where we haven't had them. So in your most recent book, you talked about Douglas Rushkoff's theory that we're trying to run a 21st century system on a 13th century operating system. Yeah, I love that line. Talk to that one for us.
Well, I think there are certain elements of the way in which we behave as society which are deeply cultural and very resistant to change. And so the longest lived institution in the world is probably the Christian church, the Catholic Church in particular. And I grew up in parts of the world like Northern Ireland, Cyprus, visited Israel in the 50s. And everywhere I went as a child, I was sent to a Catholic convent school in Northern Ireland in Imamadi. I was a notional Protestant. There were only 3 Protestants in school. So we were beaten up every day for 3 years. So from a very early age, this side of the cultural context in which we live was rammed in a way quite badly. People had these sort of beliefs which they will die for, and said we kill other people for. So I think there's this hard wiring built into our societies, which we tend not to think about because it's been there forever. So it might be in 13th century, it might have been in the 17th century, or whatever benefits are. Well, you think about accounting and the rules, they go back 500 years, and double entry accounting and so on. So, but we don't think about that. And in economics, we tend to think about, economists know what they're doing. Well, they did disagree with each other, and every so often there are inflection points in that work. But I think the time that really became clear to me, I was at a very radical university in the 60s, late 60s, and I went to study economics. And the 2 economists who I really, I was about to say enjoyed, I mean, I'm really fascinated by their work. One was Nikolai Kondratiev, the other was just Schumpeter. Both of Schumpeter picked up Kondratiev's torch, but they both said the same thing. But instead of doing what economists often think they do. Economies go in straight line. No, they really don't. They go through these wild cycles. They had inflection points and all the rest of it. And so I was fascinated in that. And so I think reading their work was really important to me. And so it's this cultural wiring which is invisible to us. And the question is, how do you change that? Your point about working from home that took a COVID pandemic to change that. That's a small example of what we're going to have to do with our brains. Because, I mean, you think about all these millennia of Christian faith, which basically privilege human beings over nature. Somehow we've got to close that gap. And I don't think Christianity will do its harvest festivals and have popes who do encyclicals around science and stuff. But it's hardwired, and it's almost, I think, impossible to shift. So the question is, if we still need religions or something like them, where's that going to come from and in what sort of shape? I think that will be a fundamental shift, but that's getting us into science fiction, perhaps.
Let's talk about moving forward as opposed to historic stuff. One of your phrases was sustainability being like a giant snowball rolling downhill and gathering momentum.
Yeah.
And are we still gathering snow on that?
Well, the reason I came up with that snowball comparison was that, like snowballs, if they get really big, they just entrain everything in their path. So there are sticks and branches, and there are dogs, and everything sort of cut. And if you were in business in the middle period of the sustainability era, it just seems whatever you were being asked to do, and you did it, like produce an annual sustainability report, and then there would be a bunch of other things that come along as well. So sustainability just kept getting bigger and bigger and more complicated and more complicated. And I'm just trying to say, I understand why that's the case, because we're dealing with a dysfunctional system, and it has many different dimensions. But at some point, we're going to have to say, and there's some strategic priorities, and we are prepared to sort of pick what those, or work with people as to pick what those priorities should be. So that's where it came from. Is the snowball getting bigger? No, I think I've talked about a sustainability recession. I think the ESG recession, environmental social governance investment in particular, that's seriously in recession, in fact, where people are wondering whether it ever comes back. I think it will, and it'll be tight, and it could evolve. I don't think sustainability will ever go away. I think it's almost like concepts like humanity or liberty or it's one of those North Stars that is always out there and really important directionally. But I do think we're going to be on the back foot for 2 to 3 years with Trump in the White House. He's already coming out of Paris Agreement and so on. So, but in a way, I welcome that. And there's some part of me that is I'm feeling more optimistic than I have done for 10 to 15 years. And it's partly delusional. I mean, but there's something in me that likes a good fight. And now the battle lines, will probably speak from the military language, but it's becoming clear that if we want a sustainable future, we really are going to have to fight for it. And that is something that I'm not looking forward to, but it certainly gets my it charges me up in a stretch.
That's exactly it. The system's energized again.
Yeah.
So bureaucracy, inertia, complete lack of any form of energy, positive or negative, it is the death of the system. Where you've got some form of momentum, you can direct it, you can influence it, you can get people to have a conversation on things. I think where we feel it, almost natural capital as a concept feels like an element, that bigger snowball that's rooted off on its own and is rolling.
Yeah.
And for us, it does feel like that momentum still continues.
Like in your space, the snowball is still building. And I think one of the things that's happening is that people are finding climate change and all of that stuff increasingly politically contested. And to some degree, they're doing stuff in that space. Whereas the natural, the biodiversity and ecosystems and biosphere side of all this, that feels even more important. and less politically contested. And no, we don't yet know how to do all that sort of stuff. So I think that the snowball probably will break up into different smaller pieces, and it'll build a hill space for quite some time to come. I think and hope.
Ditto. So we're kind of people have accused you of living through the golden generation of sustainability, which you reassuringly says hasn't happened yet. Hopefully, I feel as if we're really lucky at the time of natural capital, because I wrote a piece a few months ago equating where we are in the natural capital economy to being a bit like the development of the internet, but in the dial-up age.
Yeah.
So I remember that. Well, exactly. Okay, so when that first presented, it was slow, cumbersome. None of the things that we needed for it to work as it does now existed. So switching protocols, security, the ability to pay for things online, it just wasn't there. So you rapidly accelerated into the dot-com boom. And then in garages in Stanford and across the US, people were coding and building the PayPals and the things we didn't even know we needed yet. I think that's where we are with natural capital. We're so early. And this week alone, a company called B0,
I saw the higher
raised their Series C at 30 million. That's for a ratings agency.
Yeah.
So for a ratings agency, that all they're doing is grading other carbon products, and that's not to belittle them, they're a brilliant company. Congratulations. We've sent them a thank you and a well done note. Because we need them, and we need an insurance now. There's 2 or 3 products that you can insure carbon credits now. So if you've got a rating agency, you've got insurance products, it's now a vatable thing as well. So HMRC believe it's going to be big enough that it's taxable. So they're the sort of pillars you need to build a system. But we're 20 years away from the equivalent of the smartphone, and in our world of equating into the internet, Steve Jobs isn't back at Apple yet.
I don't think we are 30 years away. And one of the reasons why I am more optimistic than I have been for a very long time is that I think we're hitting a very major inflection point in our societies. I think what's happening with a certain form of republicanism in the United States is driven in part by this sense that the world that they have known is about to change. And even though he's saying drill baby drill and all the rest of it, and is funded by oil and gas folk, they know their business is going to shrivel over time. The oil states know the same. And to your point about the iPhone, I think the acceleration curves that are now building all around us are going to come far faster than we're actually used to dealing with. And part of it, they're going to be accelerated by AI itself. It's amazing when you look at material science or enzyme science or whatever to see what some of these AI programs are actually enabling us to do. So 20 years, I think, is the old time scale for what's going to happen. 8 to 15 years, I think, is the actual one that's going to play through. And God help us all, because it's going to have lots of downsides alongside the upsides.
You know what, you're right. I think I've fallen into the trap of working with the easy narrative. So that 20 years is always the soundbite. Is no one gets offended if you say it's 20 years away, because it's someone else's problem.
Yeah.
Whereas, and so myself and Chris Winter, our director of Natural Capital, we published our first forward pricing curve on carbon last year.
Interest.
We were asked to. We got all we work with internally.
Is this funding the name? Yeah. How does it see it?
So the mistake we made last year, we didn't have the heart to put out a curve that showed systematic climate failure at the end of dates, because that would have seen the price of carbon do this until everyone was there.
Yeah.
So instead we said, okay, well, no, let's assume society solves it in 2050. But neither of us believed that. Yeah. It was just hopeful. So we're going to do an updated version this year. And we took counsel from 15 or so experts in the field last year. We hope to reach 100 this year, so it'll be far more of a crowdsourced piece.
Yeah.
And then our intention is hopefully next year we won't do this, somebody else will, because we're essentially marking our own homework to a degree. Yeah. But we want someone else to take this on as a project and to lean that forward. But yeah, we didn't have the heart to say, actually, we don't think it is going to solve itself, where you will this year.
I'd love to see that. I'd
share by all means. So let's go from global to more on the ground type activity. Talk to me about how you feel about Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, and how you view their efforts and practices and where they sit.
But one of the trends I see at the moment is that people who've worked on corporate responsibility, sustainable business, these sorts of agendas for quite a long time are starting to lose confidence starting to do with space. So Jonathan Park, for example, who I've worked alongside, sometimes with Figure Group, sometimes collaborated with, is getting to win his life, I think. I can't speak for him, but where he's feeling it's not worth working with the uniqueness of this world, but he's starting to focus on Just Stop Oil or Extinction or Venom, these sorts of people. I think that's in some ways a mistake. Not, I totally understand why he is where I understand he currently finds himself, but we have to change business. We have to change the way markets operate. And I think Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil and the people who come after them, and others will come after them, need to be brought into the world of business to some degree. Their views have to be not just sort of splattered on glass front windows of big corporate headquarters, but they have to be heard in boardrooms and so on. And people, the extraordinary thing is when you see some of these very powerful people confronted by somebody like Greta Thunberg or whatever, they suddenly start to make connections that they wouldn't otherwise make. When they see them on the media, that's one thing. But when they suddenly have them in their own space, they're thinking, oh my God, my daughter or my son or whatever, they're saying the same things and I'm discounting those. And perhaps I shouldn't. So I think we absolutely depend on successive waves of activists and campaigners doing things that their elders and so on wouldn't dare to do. And I think there have been analyses that show every big social movement tends to depend at a certain point in its development on people doing things that are completely unacceptable. So anti-slavery, suffragism, civil rights, now climate change, people are going to have to do things which break the mold, which deeply upset people. But the one thing I would say about some of the things that some of these groups have done, you can upset people too much. You can get them to the point where they think, well, just fuck you. I'm like, if you're going to stop my trip to work or whatever, and I'm playing on your house in perpetuity. And if you get to that point, I don't think that's terribly helpful. So, and it's very difficult to judge
Whether it's like move the Overton window without smashing it.
It's very easy to be judgmental because I've worked with so many different activists and campaigners. I love them to pieces, and not all of them, and some of them are distinctly uncomfortable. But I've always said, don't listen to us. Talk to these people. And I've always said to clients, if it ever comes to the crunch where it's a choice between you, our client, and NGOs or activists or whatever, we'll always sign that one. Doesn't mean that they're always right, but they're a leading indicator where the future will take us and where it'll take you. That's become less of an issue in recent times because there's been some form of convergence. But at the same time, I actually think we're going to see a lot more violent activism. Ken Stanley Robinson's book, Ministry for the Future, there's a various, you probably, if you don't read fiction, you probably haven't read it. The partway through the book, there's this very short sequence where a UN-style agency gets into black ops and suddenly CEOs start to be assassinated in the privacy of their own homes and bedrooms and so on. And from that moment on, the arc of the story starts to shift. I'm not advocating that we assassinate. God knows we just had one in New York and the pharmaceutical business, but by God, that got people talking about the dynamics in the American healthcare market. So, and when these things happen, they partly get people to think and talk, but they fulfill people's assumptions, and you get an entrenched. People become more entrenched, and they just say, if that's where you're taking us, we just want you all in prison. And I think what the British government has done with Just Stop Oil, putting people in prison, is utterly shameful, and it's 18th century stuff. But we should tag these people because they really are dramatizing stuff that most of us would care not to think about most of the time.
Yes, it's
as you say, throughout history, there's always been pushing beyond the acceptable position, and then we revert back 20-30% before there, and that gets us the direction of travel.
Yeah.
And I wonder, what are your views on the sort of no farmers, no food rhetoric? Because that's a campaign group that isn't advocating for change.
Yeah.
It's advocating strongly for no change. Well, depends on how you view the position, but it's very much advocating for the status quo or an improvement upon the status quo. How do you view that movement and its effectiveness?
It's difficult because, in developed societies, we tend to take food for granted. We take a diversity of choice of food for granted as well. And what we're seeing is farmers in some regions of the world coming under a growing stress. And some of it's climate related. So in Britain, for example, we see a lot more flooding, soil waterlogging, and so on. So people thought it was all a bit about heat and crop exhaustion in some ways, but it's coming at us in so many ways. So farmers have always had a tough time. I mean, for millennia. So I sympathize. But I think I sympathize in the same way that I understand. I think what Trump is trying to do, which is to protect the world that he knew and the interests of people providing his funding. But as somebody said earlier on today, all they're doing is enabling China to monopolize to an even greater extent the green economy than they had done today. Raw materials right through to batteries and electric vehicles and so on. With farmers, I was reading this morning about an Icelandic microalgae farm using geothermal heat and so on. If you look, I'm going to do the same trick that you just made 20 years, 25 years into the future, our diet would have shifted quite significantly. Now, I should declare, I've been a vegetarian for 50 years, and I don't think we're going to give up meat, because I think meat will continue to, animals will still be needed in regenerative farming. There's no question about that in my mind. But I think we're going to have to eat a lot less animal-based, slaughtered meat, and there will be synthetic alternative proteins. And at the moment, they've been experimented with. People have either liked them or not. To some degree, that the idea of that there's these sort of alternative burgers and the rest of it is slightly waning. But that's one of these cycles where it just goes through. So the farmers, I think, probably sense, a bit like Trump supporters, that the world is going to change and change convulsively, and they're pushing back against that. But they're simply guaranteeing that when the change comes, it comes faster and harder.
And without one.
It's a lovely way of putting it, but I think probably true.
And so you're in a unique position to have seen the last 25 years of change in food and diet, and you've predicted that 25 that's going to come. Where on that spectrum of where you were 25 years ago in terms of people's diets and meat eating and things, to where you think we'll be, are we halfway there, or do you think the rate of change of diet will be greater than it has been?
I don't know, and I always uncomfortable when somebody says anybody is unique, because there are a fair number of people out there who had at least as long a working life as I had, and we should ask them what their views are on all of this. But one of the groups I really like, UK, based in the UK and in Silicon Valley, it's called Rethink X. And they have an exponential model, as you know, and they've looked at everything from mobility and transport through energy, through food. And one of the things that they looked at is the emergence of precision fermentation. And for 15, 20 years, I worked with the biotechnology industry. I edited a newsletter on that world back from the early 80s onwards. And, what we were thinking about then as being, a long time out into the future, it's now starting to engage very serious indeed. So I think that will change. I think partly because people have no choice, the pricing factor will come into it. But also younger people, I think, will opt for different lifestyles, some different diets will go with that. It doesn't always take us in the direction where you want to go. So we're headed towards high density foods. We're headed to very highly packaged foods and so on. So there are a lot of these trends I think we've got to break. But I think we'll see a lot of change for good and ill, and a lot more than we might expect based on the last 35 or 50 years.
And another of the groups slash movements that we talked about previously, and B Corp and the certification around there.
Yeah, I mentioned Rethink X, and what I didn't do there was to close the loop and say why I think they're important.
Oh, from Libya.
Mainly they do global studies. On the food one, meat, they were looking at the United States in particular, and this is some years ago. But they basically conclude that with precision fermentation able in time to give us everything you can do by slaughtering a cow and using the skin, the milk, the meat or whatever, can be done in the fermenter. And because of the technology, the price comes down very, very rapidly. They were saying by the 2030s, so it's still within our time scale, something like 60% of the animals on American farms will no longer be there. But even if that's 20% of that number, and even if it's in about 2040s, you've got a huge number of American farmers that are going to be shaken out of their employment. And the same's happening in truck driving and a whole range. So I think the political aspects of what's coming is very, very interesting. To the V Corp, I love that world. I mean, we incubated BLAF UK, the instigator of the B Corporation movement in United Kingdom, which is now I think the biggest chapter worldwide. We had them under our wing at Bonans for the first 9 months. I mean, I love what they do. I think it's true that it's still a rounding error on business across the planet, because what are we talking about? Tens of thousands of companies potentially, but not millions of companies. But they will have a catalytic influence. So I'm encouraged by that world. But I think my own work, my own thinking is going off in a slightly different direction, which is towards, I put in a piece of writing just recently saying that in a way what we've been doing is akin to, if you may remember at school physics lessons of magnetism, you'd have a piece of blotting paper with a magnet underneath it, and all the iron findings that you put on top would suddenly stand out like the hair and static. And I think in a way we've been dealing with individual iron findings, companies, and yes, they're boards, and yes, they're business models, and yes, they're subgradients, and so on, but the very small elements of the pound. What we've not been promptly addressing is the magnetism, the magnetic fields, the markets, and how you shape markets. So I think B Corp, the B Corp sector, as I say, can have a catalytic impact. But unless and until it gets to the point where it actually materially influences and reshapes market forces, it's going to be nice to have rather than a really the sort of the level of change dynamic that we really need now.
So I have a unique, as a word again, opportunity to sit down with 8 of the shortlist of leading founders or CEOs in the natural capital sector. There's so few of us in the UK at the moment. We can get around the table. Okay, most, not all. So I had that perspective and that opportunity to not look at Guy and Fireland, to look at the magnetism for us. So that's all right. How do I make the most of that, John? What's the key things when I get that group of people around the table? How do I use that opportunity we have so early in our industry?
But it goes back to that earlier discussion that we had around patience and on the other side of it, stamina. I don't think any group of people, however well attention and however influential, in a single conversation is going to get to an outcome that changes the world materially. So I think whatever you do, it's got to be on the basis of, we're in this together, let's recognize that, and we're going to work together, even though it may be at times we may even compete in some ways. We're going to help create standards, we're going to help create expectations, almost roadmaps, and so on, and collectively communicate what's going on, and honestly communicate what's working and what isn't, so we share the learning. So I think I tend to think of things like that as huge opportunities to start movements rather than we have a meeting, everything changes. But it may be a magical meeting.
Wherever you down the door. So that's the hope that we'll be together often.
So you've got a few points there that do feel different about this sector. So when I go back to when I first started coming out of university into the environment sector, mid 2000s, 2010, it was a very protective, closed group. So you'd even get the wildlife trusts that would disagree with one another. Neighbour, oh no, that's Herefordshire or Worcestershire. Or, oh yeah, it was very protected, insular and non-invented here. And I think over the last 3.5 years while OC's been a thing, that is totally different in the sector. And I think we've seen people coming from very divergent worlds. So right now, you've got lots of people coming out of the financial world and sort of traditional entrepreneurial business sectors.
Yeah.
And where we have got together, we've said, and it was triggered by a word of your book about Fred it is, early in the...
Not my word, but yes.
Yeah, and about the genesis of the sort of sustainability sector. Well, they in my view, they haven't fallen yet in the natural capital place. Everyone is playing really nicely together, is collaborating, is competitive with themselves about improving their businesses, but is very collaborative. So it feels like we've got an opportunity to make sure this wave is caught well and served together. So in the next month or so, as many of the founders from the sectors we can get better come and visit our Monaco.
That's brilliant. Share from there. So well done. I mean, just a sidebar in a way. I mean, one of the things I did when I was at university first time around was to look into cults and religious movements and so on. And one of the things you do realize is over time, if you look at all of that, is that very human. And so if there's something that any group of humans feels strongly about, and they might be communist and, the early part of the 20th century, they might be green folk or whatever, you very quickly, absent very strong external pressures, start to disagree on tiny minutiae of how many angels on the pinhead or whatever. And so what you saw when you first came in probably was an element of that. And you see it in the NGO world. People really fight bitterly about what from the outside world seems to be very small considerations or differences. And I think when the market does engage, there are positives, and you discuss some of them, but there are a lot of negatives as well. And I think part of what we have to think about now is, as those sort of precursors, those pioneers from the sort of campaigning and activists and so on world increasingly get marginalized, which it tends to happen when these sort of shifts, that they go mainstream. How do we keep their voices? How do we keep their values in what's coming next? And I don't always know how to do that.
The word cult's fascinating because Elle behind you was celebrating off camera because she openly tells people we're a cult. And be careful with that one.
Well, no.
So the genesis of this is there's a book called Unreasonable Hospitality by a gentleman called Will Guidara.
Sure.
Beautiful book. He took a restaurant in America from style restaurant to the best restaurant in the world.
Right.
And the way they win those awards is not by just being good at something. It's about creating an inflection point in some aspect of food.
Yeah.
His was the first restaurant that did that in hospitality.
Brilliant.
So it was the experience, the touch point. So they'd research the person when they arrived. So they could greet them by name and just beyond what was reasonable. So reasonable. And he had a section there that Ella's joked for a while. So we talk about culture in the business.
Yeah.
And it's actually got me t-shirts that have the cult bit in bold and the bit without. And so in his book, there's a chapter that literally says, cult is what people who've never worked in a business that had a culture think it is. So
That's very interesting.
yeah, it's a fascinating book.
Yeah, but and again, I think it's groups of people who are either embattled or feel that they're embattled, that the world doesn't understand them. That's where you get these sort of tensions on best ways forward. And again, I think it's incredibly human, and we'll see it playing out time and time again. And many of these people, if you get the tech billionaires coming to this space, God save us, but they're beginning to, Google is making available its satellite remote sensing data and analytical skills to activist groups, NGOs, and so on. Yeah, we welcome them initially, and then you've got a sort of Trojan horse situation. So I feel the next 10, 15 years are going to be immensely exciting But I keep saying to younger colleagues, I feel at the same time, though I think they're going to be exciting, they're going to be off the scale challenging, and they're going to be at times politically deadly. Because suddenly people are going to realize what it is that people like us are asking for. They're going to feel existentially threatened, and they're going to start to bite much dirtier than they had done today. So I don't look forward to that, but I think we've got to brace ourselves for some of that.
As a aging, changing, playful provocateur over the years, that's got to have come with its criticism, its attack, its challenge. How did you ride those waves and maintain your resilience and happiness during this period?
I was reflecting on some of the pushback that has happened, and at different stages, it's come from different people. And initially, it would come from people in the NGO world. I remember when we did the Green Consumer Guide in 1988, Jonathan Porridge, who I've already referenced, and came back and said, you can't rely on consumers to change the world. And I said, really, I think I'm seeing them as shock troops. If you can mobilize them for a period of time, they have an influence which is out of proportion to their numbers, because people didn't expect pressure to come from that direction. But I agree, if you rely on consumers to do all this indefinitely, that simply won't happen. What was the question again?
The resilience, when you're criticized or that's a task. So how do you carry that? Does it bother you? If it does, how do you work through that?
I've often had this sort of odd capacity to internalize people's voices, so that even if somebody has criticized me deep in prehistory, they're still in my brain, and so I can still hear their voices when we're talking earlier on about, flying and so on. I could hear the voices that I've encountered over time, many of whom I respect immensely, and I agree with, and yet, I sort of taking a different choice. I almost think that if you don't get pushback, you're not doing the work that you should be doing. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't look forward to it or wellness or whatever, but it's I say that we should be prepared for it, because we do increasingly understand that it's a system that is dysfunctional. It's a system that we have to change, and that when systems change, it's it's existentially challenged for people who are operating the old system, the old order. And I think, again, I think that's why I'm feeling sort of this sort of level. Optimism is the wrong word. It's agitation. It's exciting. Yeah, it's almost like yeah. I'm not going to give the end medical. That was going to would be unsavory. But there we go. Too military for words.
Okay. So I also did some work with a lot of Japanese consultants about how they do process improvement. And they literally taught, if you were going through an organization or structural change program, you couldn't use people that wouldn't be part of the future to help design a new process. So you'd almost split your workforce in two, and you would get the ones to run your existing plan or process. And then you would use your new, talented, future-focused workforce to design the future state. Well, we've got this playing out. Some of those conflicts and turmoil that you mentioned before are going to be because we've got people who won't have a fundamental role in the future, either because their products, their services, or their way of life is in the future, but they're still part of it, so they can see that coming. And it comes back to that farmer analogy. I think what a lot of farmers that we interact are seeing is they're not seeing people say the way we manage the land's not sustainable and not appropriate. They hear, you're not acceptable anymore as a person who is a way of life.
And in fact, that is what we're saying to them, that unless you can change, you're not acceptable. And that is existential for people. And one of the things I said to you, I passed a moment ago about pushback, criticism, and I don't enjoy it. I'm an actor, but it's a way that you change, you evolve.
How are you heady though? Does it bother you and upset you? So are you thinking about it for days on end, or?
In the moment, in particular moments, yes, I do. I mean, I remember before The Independent did a cartoon of me, which was, I can't remember which way around. It was either a sheep in wolf's clothing or the other way around. But it was the first time, in that sort of medium that people were saying, you're too close into industry. You'll be paid by these people. And so that's a long time ago, but it's still there. But if you talk to Elaine, my wife, she would say she holds things for much longer than I do. I tend to, I'm not like a dove. I mean, things that completely sort of roll off my back the whole time. But unless you can allow some of the emotional turmoil to sort of move behind you, remembering some of the lessons you've learned along the way, you burn out. And I've seen that happen time and again with campaigners and activists who care too deeply and too urgently. I'm never going to be satisfied.
I try to process the emotion faster. So how do I do that? And then, so it helps a bit like you working with multiple clients allowed you to almost effectively give one a bit of time to think about stuff. Yeah. You were looking at other things. Because I have lots of different aspects of the business or issues to work on. I can give myself a window of time to feel something, to test what if 1% of it was true. Can we learn anything from it? Or is it just a crazy ranting person that doesn't like? How do we change it? Yeah. And then I'm very fortunate with my team. Some people talk about being a chief exec as being a lonely thing. I don't feel that way as well. I've got 4 directors and 4 heads of that I share everything with. So I find the right person who can either support or debate or challenge or often have a different perspective to me. We'll talk it through, explore it at pace. And then when I move on to the next subject, I can leave it behind. Yeah. And so that's great. Sort of resonate. Weekends and Christmas is harder because you have to respect people's boundaries to a degree. So if you sat with it over a few days, it can be.
But it's funny that question made me think, and one element of my answer would be, because I write books as well. There's a part of me where I can say what I like in a book, and even if I'm trapped in a situation with a particular company, I'm not 100% trapped. That there's this other dynamic going. And I think the writing side of this and public speaking and so on has been part of what's given me, I don't know which way it actually works, but that sense of freedom and the capacity to say what I think rather than thinking and saying what I think the client wants me to think and say.
And have you ever been asked how you think? i.e. how thoughts move through your mind?
It's not formally. I mean, the questions like that have come on. I mean, it's difficult to come around every so often, but it's difficult to answer because how do you know how your brain thinks? But mine is very fluid, and I'm not wildly logical. So you asked earlier on kindly about the triple bottom line or other things like that, the product recall. I didn't logically go through a sequence of steps to get to a conclusion. It roils, and then I stir the pot in different ways, and then it used to be cyclic or getting under nature or whatever, and then suddenly something surfaces, and bully pop. Yeah, it's exactly.
It's
like
one of my favorite questions. So mine is like a fireworks plate. So if you get an idea, my brain will go, oh, I could go in all these 15 different directions. And each one of those goes in another one. And where I learned to write was when I want to explore a topic and focus.
Yeah.
If I write, it keeps me on a topic and makes me explore it and really learn what I think about it. And some of the other people in the team that we've talked about this, they describe sort of the elongated roll of waves. So we'll think of thought all the way through.
Yeah.
And Abby, who works in the marketing team, she's like, it's like the tube map. Straight lines to everything. You can only think in that way. So I love asking people how they process thoughts in their mind because they come up with such wonderful visualizations. So you've now got this bubbling pot that pops up and things.
That was your visualization. You articulated it. I just carried it to ABS did. I talked about bubbling. That was a fountain rather than a pot. Okay, but nice. But it's also my brain makes. I don't know whether you've done the Myers-Briggs.
Yeah, I used to hate them.
Well, we put our team through it a number of times, and I came out INFP, so very introverted. So yeah, until I was 19, 20, I was completely shy. I did public speaking. I sometimes did it because I had to, but I hated it. But learned over time how to become more extroverted. But the rest of it is all about perception and intuition and so on. And on intuition, I was completely off the scale. So it's I don't know. How are you?
The research to your brain.
I mean, the best ones are, I think. It's the one I'm stuck with. Yeah, but it'll change a lot over the years. I don't know. I really don't know. Because I've always been fascinated by, at one stage, it was about history and why societies fought each other in civil wars or religious wars or whatever. That hasn't gone away. I mean, I'm still curious in the patterns that erupt in our societies and civilizations and so on. But you're right. I mean, experience does shift those.
There was a couple of questions that we cast on this that I'd love to go back to. My perception of the environment sector is it's held to a standard, there's a whole different debate about where you draw the boundary around the environment sector. It's held to an unusual standard whereby if someone does something wonderful for the environment, say they plant 1 million trees, someone will spin around and go, but did you restore that peatland? Or you had to drive a diesel vehicle to get there, or the flight challenge or whatever. In the sector, we still don't seem to celebrate positive as opposed to find a chick in the arm and criticize that.
Yeah.
Have you observed similar? And if so, why do you think that's the reality we have?
I think it's partly because the original driving force for environmentalism had elements of religiosity, of a religion, and in the sense that there's a value set that comes with that, which basically, I'm thinking partly of Catholicism. It goes to guilt, and it goes to, we're sinful and original sin and all the rest of it. And I'm not saying that environmentalists are all like that. You have Buddhists, you have atheists, you have all sorts of people. But there is this sense that what that lot are doing is wrong. And even if they do something right, that's trying to deflect our attention from their fundamental criminality. So yes, I have come across it. I think it has shifted a bit over time. I think when I started trying to engage business, that was anathema to most other environmentalists. I was seen to be going off on a completely self-serving trajectory and so on. Whereas now, it's not across the board, but people are much more interested in the role of business, the role of markets, even could help us know how capitalism might evolve over time to sort of take on board some of this sort of stuff. So again, when younger people say to me, nothing's changed over 50 years, I said, I would say, you have no sense. I wish you could have a sense of how much things have changed. But it doesn't mean that we're even on the sort of trajectory that we shouldn't be on. But you've got to understand that we have made some progress, and now we've got to build on that and accelerate it.
Yeah, I'm starting to see an element of that. I don't have to tell you yet, but I can see the 20 years I've been in the sector, that things have significantly changed. Pre-auction conservation, a big project in the environmental sector was 50 to 100,000 pounds. That would have got a press release. Yeah. We're now in a very privileged position, thanks to some amazing backing, of having £150 million pop on the earth for conservation. That is hopefully is one of those inflection points.
It is, and it changes yeah. No, it's one of the things that has driven me since, and I've said it a number of times, but when I was 14, I read a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn as a school. And it absolutely radically shaped the way I saw the world, because it basically talked about paradigm shifts. For the first time, it was published in the early 1960s. And it talked, and every so often I go back and try and find the book, because I can't believe what I remember Kuhn as having said. One of the things he said is that a paradigm shift, properly considered, takes about 70 to 80 years to go through. And you need at least 1 to 2 generations to be removed from the sea before it can really take on. And I think the paradigm that we've been occupying since the Industrial Revolution started to shift really materially in the late 50s with the work of Jim Lovelock around the electron capture detector, all that stuff around atmospheric chemistry and so on. And I think it's been building since then. So there's 65 70 years. And so that's one of the reasons why I think the next 10 to 15 years are just going to be so blindingly surprising, because at this very, very deep fundamental level, going right back to the images of Earth, Earthrise and the rest of it from the NASA space capsules, something has been building in the human psyche, which we don't probably understand. And forgive me if I go back to religions, because I think that's historically how our species has coped with all of that. And I don't want the green and the sustainability and all the rest of it agendas to wrap themselves in religion. But I think that will, to some degree, happen over the next 50 to 100 years. We'll see something like that. God knows how it's gonna present itself or where it can take us. That's coming.
You mentioned Greta Thunberg earlier.
Yes.
Her generation hasn't arrived yet. So if you think about it, so I remember when she did an amazing session in Bristol where the entire Cathedral Marine was covered in people for the day. And I spoke to some colleagues at the time whose 9 and 10-year-old children had posters of Greta on their wall.
Yeah.
They're in uni now.
Yeah.
They haven't even come out yet. So the sort of people who are viewing that as a spot in time that isn't going to carry waste forward, we have not seen that generation arrive in the workplace yet. Never mind what they're founding and running. They totally well. So yeah, that was going to be huge enough.
Well, it's funny because I mentioned earlier on the waves analysis that I started in 1924, and that went environment, green, sustainability, Greta, because I think almost in an iconic way, and I'm going back to the sort of religious icon language of a saint who sort of pops up and suddenly embodies a complete new agenda. But what was really I found utterly remarkable about her, and it often goes back to her psychology and her wiring, is that she could talk to older people with this authority, which a Joan Bach would have had, but that capacity to address the system and its major champions.
Well, and accessible in such a way that any young person could say, I could do that. Perhaps the best type of role model that was accessible, and especially the neurodiversity that she spoke about, meant even people who had that, who might have felt, well, how could I possibly do that? Wow, I do. Excuse me, I can now, which is amazing. When we talked about always the green on green conflict, and people challenging people doing the right thing for the environment, I literally wrote a piece on traveling down this morning about one thing I think the sector does terribly. We're now in a pattern of just announcing things for the sake of announcing it. So we'll put out a strategy, a document, and it'll say, we're going to achieve this.
That's part of buttons, that's party funding, in the sense people want to see impact and outcomes. And so
She undermines the funding.
I totally agree, but I think I understand why people
Agreed. So one of my rules about criticism is if you're going to criticize somebody, offer an alternative.
Yeah.
So in there, it's like, okay, yes, you want to announce this. All you need to do is a little bit more thought out detail of by doing X, and we're going to measure Y, and we're going to report Z, so that you can. So each year we release our green print at the start of the year. We say across this year we aspire to do this. Yeah, we have some numbers on it, some measurables where we don't always know them. And at the end of the year, we close with, we hit this one, we missed that one, this one we totally pivoted on, this one we're going to move forward to next year. But at least then, if we come out and say something, so we didn't even have a website until we bought 4 estates, because we wanted to have something authentic and real to talk about. Because I think people now, whether it's clients, whether it's customers, whether it's prospective members of staff, they can tell when something isn't authentic and true. We refuse to use I mean, we've got a wonderful photographer and videographer, but we refuse to use a stock image of anything, because you're going to lie about your imagery. What else are you going to lie about?
Yeah, no, and I see that. And one of the things I think you're building is a sort of a resource which will have a huge value over time. One of the things I've learned over time is that if you can let to break people out who are senior leaders or whatever, of the reality that they see day to day, and put them into a very different situation, circumstance or whatever. So you mentioned earlier on convening people on some of these farms. I think getting people out to real world regeneration projects is incredibly important. And when people talk about study tours or learning gens or whatever, I think we've got to do a lot more of that. I remember this growing ecotourism is a big part of what we're doing to give people the opportunity to visit. That's brilliant. But I'm not talking about people who decide to go on a holiday. I'm thinking about breaking people out of the sort of corporate world and taking them somewhere else and immersing them in a different reality. What I was going to say is there's a group called Leader Squares who took a group of CEOs and similar level business leaders to California. And one of them, who was the chairman of Daimler, wanted to go and see a startup company, Better Place, Product Better Place, Shai Agassi's firm. And this guy who was used to being treated like the foreign minister German, he was German, met Shai Agassi, who basically said, I don't know why you're here. Within 10 years, we'll have run you off the road. When you look at what Tesla have now done, Elon Musk and all the rest of them, that's what's happened. But that chairman was heard in the restroom afterwards saying to himself, fuck, I've been briefed on this. I've read books about this. I know this stuff. This is the first time when viscerally it's got me. Now I'm over elaborating what he actually said while he was in the restroom, but that sort of visceral shock is what we need to get people to experience. But then you've got to actually work with them to make sure that it doesn't simply send them skittering off into a different direction, but that they then apply that understanding in a constructive, creative, regenerative way over time.
I completely agree. It's one of the reasons why it was so important for us to have such a range of geographies, topographies, landscapes. So wherever someone feels they need to have an environment or whatever makes contextual sense to them, we could take them to show them that they do
there to lose them. I would part with them or sell them as a portfolio and have somebody else run them.
We'll still rule them with a contract afterwards for a period because whoever a buyer would be, at least 10 years. So whoever a buyer would be would need us to deliver on the commitments we made in the others there. And then I think probably because I'm asked what's my favorite estate, my answer is the next one. Because it's a clever one from me because it helps move it forward.
Yeah. John, our time is sadly coming to an end. This has been an absolute...
Oh, please, I'm beginning to freeze. These are little ice crystals.
I do not ever have one more question for you.
Oh dear, the killer one.
It is my favorite question.
What's the one question I haven't asked you wish I had?
I don't know. You've been fairly thorough in the Inquisition, and I think
Usually it happens in a similar way. So a question pops into someone's head and they kick it away. So like, I don't really ask that one, and they kick it away.
I can't think of anything I don't know to be asked. I always say, I'm happy to try. And this hasn't got very personal. I mean, elements of that's come through. One of the things I try and explain to my wife, Elaine, is that I feel, and this isn't guilt in the way that you were touching on earlier on, but I feel there's a real charge sheet that could be put in front of my generation of, if I can use the word activists, I chose to work through business and markets and the rest of it, but of people who tried to change the world, as to whether we actually did the right things in the right order and with the appropriate level of effect. But I think we were making it up throughout, and therefore, that's some sort of excuse. But the changes are not done as fast as we would have hoped and at the scale that we have needed. And therefore, I don't think I'm an eco-criminal. And I don't think that by getting the corporate world interested in this, even with all greenwashing and so on that's happened as a result, I don't feel guilty about that. But there is this fundamental feeling that somehow, and I say this collectively, not just on my own account, we've not done this as well as we could have done. But I don't know what the alternative would have been. So it's and so you could have asked the question on that, and I would have blundered around the landscape in quite the same way.
So my world's American football, and would love that sport. Don't remember Matthew City's
Good.
what I'm going to describe is that the way they talk about the evolution of that sport is in head coaching trees. So there's a big coaching staff in the American football team, and some of the best historic head coaches, you follow the lineage of their coaching tree through, and virtually the entire league now is full of head coaches who previously were juniors working for these sort of godfathers of American football.
Yeah.
You are literally the godfather of sustainability. And there are so many companies and people out there, us included, that I don't think would be a thing if it wasn't for the work you've done. So whilst you might not be sure you had the impact at the pace or the way you wanted to, your legacy is going to continue for generations. So from me and everyone at OC, thank you so much for what you've done and for being here today. It's been an absolute privilege, John. Thank you.
Rich, that's immensely kind and very encouraging and quite warming, which I actually need in the circumstances. But actually, the odd thing is, I feel I'm only just getting started. Good. And this has been very encouraging in that direction. Thank you.
Thanks, John.